for the past few Sundays, we've been thinking about fear. And 2 Sundays ago, we thought about the fear of failure and how sometimes if we feel like we have a possibility of failing, we don't even attempt anything. Then last week, we talked about the fear of rejection and how oftentimes the fear of rejection creates in us a deep desire to conform to whatever it is that is going on around us and to kind of bend to the opinions and thoughts and pressures of other people. Fear is a spiritual issue because it stands in the way. It is a point of separation between us and then being fully open to God. And we looked at that passage, that one sentence there that Paul wrote to young Timothy, where he said, God did not give to us a spirit of fear. And so he doesn't want us to be afraid. This morning we're going to look at another fear, the fear of circumstances. You know, sometimes things in life just come our way. We didn't create them. We didn't desire them. We didn't cause them. They just happen. And so this morning we're going to look at a passage of Scripture in Daniel chapter 3. And I was sharing with the early service, this is probably one of the first Bible stories that ever just like sank within my memory bank. You know, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I can remember being in the primary department and my primary department teacher here at the church, who wasn't much taller than the 7 or 8-year-olds that were in the class. Bless her heart, she was a sweet lady. She had a felt board. Y'all ever remember the old felt boards? And remember, if you grew up in Sunday school and you're about my age or a little older, you remember the felt boards where, you know, the teachers came in, they had all the Bible characters cut out, and they put it up on that felt board, and, you know, the felt board was just kind of like magic. You know, had they stick on the felt board, you know. So anyway, I can still in my mind's eye see that little lesson from Daniel chapter 3 being up on the felt board. I want to say just one quick thing before we look at the passage this morning. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did this. Most scholars, the overwhelming opinion is they were teenagers. So we're not talking about guys like me that are, you know, 52 years old and been, you know, these aren't guys who've been men of faith for like 30 or 40 years. These are teenagers. These are teenagers who, in the face of a circumstance that they didn't create, that they certainly didn't want, man, they have some deep faith. They have some real spiritual stamina here. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 90 feet high and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, harp, pipes, all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever, but there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the golden image you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, so these men were brought before the king. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." So, these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and outer clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Now, in seminary, that passage right there where we ended was in the Old Testament called a Christophany. Don't worry about that word, but it was just simply a moment within the Old Testament where Christ was visible. Christophany. So it's a pretty amazing passage. But this morning I want us to think about how we often fear circumstances and what we can learn about faith from these 3 teenage guys who are facing what all of us would consider this morning to be a very fearful circumstance. And so I want to begin this morning by just making a quick statement, and that is that faith that is tested is faith that can be trusted. Faith that is tested is faith that can be trusted. You know, Jesus himself said in John chapter 16, says, "In this world you will have trouble." In this world you will have trouble. You know, a lot of times, and you may have heard this, I know I've heard it from time to time, but a lot of times people have this sense that, well, once they become a Christian, that somehow is immunity from trouble and crisis. Or that because they're a Christian, bad things shouldn't come their way. I want you to know this morning that no matter how often that is repeated, it is biblically untrue. Because even Jesus himself said, "In this world you will have trouble." There are going to be circumstances, there are going to be troubles, there are going to be problems, there are going to be crises that you and I are going to go through, that we're going to face. It's just part of life. Now, to finish that statement that Jesus made in John chapter 16, he said that in this world you will have trouble, but I have overcome the world. Okay? So in other words, there's no difficulty, there's no crisis, there's no problem, there's no piece of trouble that is bigger than I am. That's what Jesus is saying. 1 Peter 1:7 says this. The writer is writing, by the way, to Christians who are undergoing severe persecution. I mean, just horrible things are happening to the Christian community at the time that this letter is written. 1 Peter 1:7 said, "These trials will show them your faith is genuine." Or, another way of saying that is that this will prove your faith. And the word that the writer of 1 Peter uses there to talk about what happens to faith when it is tested, when it is tried, the word that he uses there is a word that would have been commonly understood in the first century when this letter was written. And it was that what happens to faith is similar to what happens to a metal when it is purified of all impurities. That it is proven, that metal is proven, that metal is tested to such an extent that then all the impurities are removed. And the writer of 1 Peter says that when you and I, as people of faith, encounter difficult circumstances, when we are tested, when we are tried, that then our faith becomes stronger. In fact, the word, again, that he uses is that our faith is then purified, in a sense. So a faith that is tested is a faith that can be trusted. And so I don't want you to leave here this morning thinking, gee, if I've got a problem, if I'm in trouble, if I've got a crisis, that I must not be believing hard enough or praying right enough or saying the right things. That is, don't leave here with that. And don't let anybody put that guilt trip on you. In this world you will have trouble. That's what Jesus said. And I believe Jesus. Just want you to know. If Jesus says it, I believe. So let's kind of drill down here a little bit about what can this, kind of taking it off the belt board of the primary department and putting it into kind of the realm of real life, real adulthood, where you and I are at this morning. What can this say to us about faith and about having fear in the midst of circumstances? Three things I want to say to you this morning in regard to that. First of all, faith obeys God instead of following man. Faith obeys God instead of following man. You know, tens of thousands bowed, but only 3 teenage boys stood in this story. Tens of thousands bowed down, but only 3 teenage boys stood. Faith is serious about obedience to God. And when you and I stop and think about the options that these 3 teenage guys had in this story, they're fairly varied, and they're many. And you know what? They're options that you and I have today. They're options that you and I have. They're alternatives to obedience. So I just want to name off 3 real quick, because they certainly would have been options that these 3 teenage boys could have had. First of all, they could have compromised. Option number 1, you can always compromise. They could have compromised. They could have said to themselves, you know what, we'll just bow down, we'll just go through this whole thing. We don't believe it. We're not really honoring Nebuchadnezzar. We're not with the guy. But we're just going to bow down and, you know, just kind of fit in and go with the flow, even though our heart and convictionally we're really not doing this. We'll just kind of compromise on this. I mean, what's the big deal if we just kind of bow down? Option number 1 was that they could compromise. Option number two was they could rely upon cheap grace, which is just having the attitude that, you know what, I'm going to do whatever I want to do, because at the end of the day or at the end of my life, I can always ask God for forgiveness and He's going to give it to me. By the way, cheap grace is not in the Bible. There is no such thing as cheap grace. There's expensive grace, costly grace, because it costs God tremendously to give you and I grace. What we do is not create cheap grace, we just cheapen grace. And so that was the second thing. They could just say, well, you know, we'll go through with this, and, you know, on a day when I hear the pipe play, or the horn sound, or the trumpet blow, and we have to bow down, we'll just do it, and then once we're through it, we'll just have to forgiveness and all people, you know, everything's good. That's option number 2. Option number 3 is they could certainly rationalize. Well, Nebuchadnezzar says that if we don't do this, we'll be killed. And, you know, we're faithful guys, and we have a witness, we have a testimony here. But what good is that witness or testimony going to be if we're dead? So we better go through with this, because, you know, we can't do anybody any good if we're not around them. Now, there were plenty of other options, but those are probably 3 pretty powerful ones. And you know what? As you and I go through life, we have those 3 options as well as an alternative to faithful obedience. We can compromise, we can cheapen grace, and we can rationalize. But obedience, faith, obeys God and does not follow man, no matter what the tens of thousands are doing. And so in this story, we have tens of thousands bowing down, 3 teenage guys who remain standing. It's pretty powerful witness. Second thing, faith obeys in spite of what it sees. Faith obeys in spite of what it sees. I love, and I highlighted it in my worship guide this morning, but middle of the 3rd paragraph, the three young men are standing before Nebuchadnezzar. And they say if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, and this is just a huge statement of faith right here, said, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and He will rescue us from your hand. You know, if we could just kind of narrow that down a little bit to just thinking and believing and letting it kind of settle within our spiritual DNA, the thought that God is able and He will. God is able and He will. God is able and He will. Will you say that with me? God is able
and He will.
That's a huge promise of faith. God is able and He will. You know, I've been a pastor for almost 30 years, and I want to just say to you this morning, I have seen that happen time and time and time again in my ministry and in the lives of people that I've known over the course of that ministry. God is able and He will. The church I served before I came here, there was a sweet lady, came every Sunday, came on Wednesday nights, brought her son with her, and just as salt of the earth and just as sweet and nice as you could imagine. And she was one of those folks, and we've all known folks like this, you wish you could clone them. You know what I'm saying? You wish you could just have 100 of them. Her husband never came. Her husband never came, except on 3 occasions. And you're going to guess 2 of them. Christmas and Mother's Day. Christmas, Easter, and Mother's Day. Those were the only 3 occasions that he would ever come to church. But he was as nice a guy as you could ever want to meet. Super nice guy. And I remember she would come and talk to me periodically. And she would just say to me, she'd say, Nelson, she goes, I so wish my husband would come to church with me, would worship with me. I so wish my husband would come to know the Lord and would make a profession of faith and share with me what I know. And she said, I've encouraged him, I've invited him, I've shared with him, but he's just not interested. He's just absolutely not interested. Not in the least, just not interested. Doesn't believe, doesn't want to come. But she would say to me, whenever we would have those conversations, she would always say to me, she says, there is not a single day that goes by but what I do not pray for that to happen. I can't see it. There's no indication of any movement, but she goes, there's not a single day that goes by but what I don't pray for that to happen. And man, we had that conversation numerous times. And then one Sunday, and it was not Christmas, and it was not Easter, and it was not Mother's Day, there he was, sitting with her in service. And so I thought to myself, well, it must be her birthday. There's got to be some special occasion. There's got to be something that is prompted. It's got to be her birthday. Something's going on. The next Sunday, there he was. 3rd Sunday, there he was. 4th Sunday, there he was. And so I pulled this lady to the side, and I said, what's going on? And she said, Nelson, she said something amazing. She said, I got up one Sunday, and she said, I was, about 3 or 4 Sundays ago, she said, I was just getting ready for church like I always do. And said he went in, and he got dressed, and looked at me and said, I'm going to church with you today. And again, it was not a special occasion. And she said, I didn't know what to say. She said, I was completely overjoyed. She said, I didn't know what to say. So, here he came. And then he came back, 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 and then a few Sundays later, he walked the aisle. And it's not often that a man in his 40s walks the aisle and makes a profession of faith. You with me? This would be a rare thing, sad to say. By the time I left that church, and I was there about 9 or 10 years, by the time I left that church, he was a pillar of that congregation. Totally committed. Totally committed. Sharing faith with his friends at work. Totally committed. You see, God is able. And He will. She prayed every day for something that she didn't think she'd ever see. God is able. And He will. I remember when we were in the process of relaunching this church. And me and I were sitting in my office. And we were thinking about what you see happening here every Sunday on the platform. We didn't have many praise singers. And you've heard me tell this story. The praise team was Kerry Bowman, Karen Baker, and Nelson Harris. And Nelson Harris is on the praise team. You with me? You with me? So, we didn't have any instrumentalists that we knew of, and so on and so forth, but we were going to go forward. And I remember I looked at me, and she looked at me, and I just told me, I said, what, we're just going to pray. We're just going to pray. God will send us people that we need. God will send us people that we need. And I walked in this morning, and I counted 15 people up here on the platform. You see, God is able. And He will. God is able. And He will. I remember Greg Denton. Some of you remember Greg. Greg was our music director before Amelia. And anyway, Greg came in, and at the time that Greg came in, we didn't have an instrumentalist. We had a guy named Rick Tomlinson. Rick was a great guy. Rick was playing, at that time we just had the one service, hadn't relaunched the church, he was playing a pipe organ. And Rick looked at looked at Greg and I. He'd been here for a little while as the interim, and he told us, he said, guys, in about 2 months, I need to go back to my home church. Well, we totally understood that. We totally got that. We had no resumes. We had no members. We had no responses to anything that we had posted about trying to find a minister of music. And Greg and I, we didn't know what we were going to do. We really didn't. And so that was on a Sunday. Wednesday night, Greg comes into me and he says, Nelson, he said, I was just led. He said, I don't know whether it's going to work or not, but he said, I printed out a flyer. I took one flyer and put it on the bulletin board in the music department at Roanoke College. I took another flyer and put it on the bulletin board in the music department at Hollins University. I've never done this before. We'll just see. I said, we got to do something. And we've been praying about it. We got to do something. That was a Wednesday night. Next Sunday, Greg comes into church and he says, well, would you believe it? Somebody called, having seen the flyer down at Hollins University. And I said, well, that is great. And he said, well, I hadn't met her yet. Just talked to her on the phone, and, we're going to get together a little later in the week. And he said, she's Romanian. To which, the first question I asked was, I said, well, can she speak English? Greg said, yes. And over 7 years of being with me, I realized that was just partially true. There's a lot of language that goes on in this place. Well, we didn't know what was going to happen. We just lifted it up to prayer. You see, God is able. And He will. God is able.
And He will.
And He will. You see, faith obeys in spite of what it sees, or sometimes what it doesn't see. God is able. And He will. Third thing, obedience is our responsibility. Outcome is God's responsibility. As profound as that statement is, when the 3 teenage boys say to the king, speaking truth to power, the God we serve is able to save us from your furnace, and He will rescue us from your hand, O king. But the depth of their faith is actually shown in the next sentence, because they say, even if He does not. We want you to know that we will not serve your gods. But even if He does not. Which tells me they were leaving the outcome totally to God. Their responsibility was simply faithful obedience. Obedience is our responsibility. Outcome is God's. That's a tough thing for us. Because we want to manage. We want to be in control. We want to determine the outcome. We want to manipulate the end result, the end game. And so leaving outcomes to God is tough stuff. USA Today asked their sports editors to collectively come up with what they thought were the toughest things to do in professional sport. Now, this is professional sport. So they came up with a list of what they considered to be the 15 most difficult, hardest things to do in professional sport. I'm going to give you the top 5. Number 1, they said, was downhill ski racing. The downhill. Where the human catapults down an icy bank at 80 miles per hour and tries to manage control of the skis. Number 2 was stopping a penalty kick in professional soccer. Number 3 was the Tour de France. Number 4 was running a marathon. And number 5 was returning a serve in professional tennis. Well, when you stop and think of it, those are pretty difficult things.
Yep.
Some of the others that made the list were hitting a pitch in professional baseball, for example. If I were to name for you, just from my own perspective, a top 5 difficult things to do as a person of faith, as a Christian, I would have somewhere in that top 5 leaving outcomes to God. I just say that to you confessionally. Trusting God for outcomes is probably one of the top 5 most difficult things we struggle with in faith. And yet we're reminded through the witness of Scripture and through this story that our responsibility is obedience. Outcome is God's. And so this morning, some of you are in a furnace today. I may not know about it. Nobody else may know that some of you are in a furnace today. You're in a place of crisis, you're in a place of trouble, you're in a place of difficulty, and you may be standing there fearful. I once heard a preacher preach this passage years ago, and he said, you're in one of three places. You've either just come out of a furnace, you're in a furnace, or you're getting ready to head into a furnace. Because Jesus was exactly right. In this world,